Dr. Francis Fukuyama, distinguished guests, colleagues and students of SMU and of other schools, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon and welcome to SMU. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Francis Fukuyama as the 14th speaker in the SMU Presidential Distinguished Lecture Series. And as already was said by Grace, this is the first lecture for 2014. This was a lecture series that was launched in 2005 by my predecessor, Professor Howard Hunter, with the aim of stimulating discussions among faculty, staff and students, as well as the larger external audiences on issues of contemporary interest and significance. We've had the pleasure of internationally renowned and respected academics, scholars and business leaders who have attained prominence in their respective fields to be with us here and to share with us their sometimes very refreshing insights and experience at this lecture series, so as to grow and enrich, I would say, the intellectual capacity and diversity of SMU through the interactions and the discussions. I remind you that through some of the recent guests we have had and that have graced this lecture series and shared their wisdom, or at least their ideas, with the SMU community included Dr. Fernando Flores, who is the former finance minister of Chile, Professor Zhang Jie, president of Shanghai Jiao Tong University, and Professor Tarun Khanna, director of the South Asia Institute at Harvard University. And we're therefore most privileged to have Dr. Fukuyama join the select group of outstanding speakers. As was already said, Dr. Fukuyama is one of the most eminent political thinkers and writers today. He works currently at Stanford University at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Students. And of course, we are also very proud that he is today a visiting professor at SMU, where he co-teaches the role of public policy in enabling private sector development as part of our very innovative Master of Tri-Sector collaboration program organized within our School of Social Sciences. This is a unique, I would say, a really unique master's program developed by faculty of SMU, in particular the director Anne Florini, to empower emerging leaders from the business, government and civil society to work together in order to develop sustainable solutions to the major challenges that face our world. Many of you will know Dr. Fukuyama as an author of sometimes quite controversial books, I have to say. The End of History and the Last Man, The Great Disruption, Our Post-Human Futures, State Building, and After the Neocons. All these books have been international bestsellers, translated and published in many languages. I would say that not everybody agrees with the thesis developed in some of these books. In particular, I didn't agree. But none of them actually was a book that I could set aside and say, I don't care about this book. It always stimulated my own thinking. It always created intense debates, and the ideas have always been very influential. Today, Dr. Fukuyama will speak on his latest book, The Origins of Political Order from Pre-Human Times to the French Revolution. I understand, I read the book, and it's intended to provide an account of how today's basic political institutions have developed. It is the first volume of a major two-volume work, and The Origins of Political Order begins with politics among our primate ancestors and follows the story through the emergence of tribal societies, the growth of the first modern state in China, the beginning of the rule of law in India and the Middle East, and the development of political accountability in Europe up until the eve of the French Revolution. Spanning many different disciplines, including anthropology, economics, and biology, Dr. Fukuyama has identified three key attributes of political order: the creation of a state, the rule of law, and an accountable government. And he traces the development of these three elements separately in a comparative look at the civilizations of ancient China, India, the Middle East, and Europe. I'm not going to say a lot more about this book because he's going to deliver the lecture, not me, right? But the second volume, which we talked about a few minutes ago, will bring us up to date till today. And it will be published sometime during the second half of this year. And in doing so, of course, he will get into history that gets very close to what actually we are living today. And in that sense, I would expect it to be a lot more controversial. It will in particular pay special attention to the impact that Western institutions had on institutions in non-Western societies as they sought to modernize. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure that you are all eager here for this lecture to begin. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Fukuyama on stage to address us and elaborate on these arguments and interesting observations in your book, The Origins of Political Order. We've agreed that he would speak for about 45 to 50 minutes and that then we would have ample time for some Q&A with the room. Dr. Fukuyama, please.
Well, thank you very much, President de Mayer. I'm really delighted to be here at Singapore Management University. We've been teaching with my colleague Roger Leeds a course that he described on private sector development. The students in the course are here in the audience, and I'm really extremely pleased with the interaction we've had in the 2 days we've been doing this, and look forward to the rest of the week and to meeting the larger community here at SMU. So let me get directly into the subject of my talk. I'm actually going to talk about events beyond the French Revolution. As Dr. de Mayer said, this is a 2-volume book, and I've actually completed the 2nd volume, which is really the story of the evolution. It's a theory of the evolution of political institutions really up to the present that tries to explain how we got to modern institutions of the sort that we see as the source of development in many parts of the world. And I will, although I believe that understanding the historical origin is critical for understanding the present, I really wrote this book because the focus is on the present. I should step back actually and talk a little bit about why this project began. It actually started with a very concrete, practical concern. As an American, after September 11th, the United States got involved in 2 big and pretty bloody wars in the Middle East, invading Afghanistan in 2001 and Iraq in 2003. And one of the immediate issues for American foreign policy was dealing with the fact that in the wake of these military interventions, the governments of these 2 societies largely collapsed. And in order to stabilize the situation and down the road, in order to be able to think about unwinding those interventions, it became very clear that you needed a state, you needed a government, you needed some basic political stability. And that the United States really did not have the first clue as to how to bring this about, because it had really not had a direct experience in this very basic business of state building. Now, this is not just an American problem. I think the international community has been involved in, since the end of the Cold War, in many of these exercises in places like Somalia, Afghanistan, Haiti, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now this sort of thing is going on in Mali, in northern Nigeria. There are many areas in which I think the basic problem is a vacuum of stateness. It's a vacuum of political institutions. And the solution to the development problem is really centered around the ability to get the political institutions right. Now, this is the problem that I, in the book, referred to as a problem of getting to, I'm sorry, I only got one hand, so I can only gesture. I can make quotation marks only with one hand, but I'm trying to put quotation marks around the word Denmark. So I've said that this is the problem of getting to Denmark, where Denmark is not the actual country Denmark. It's kind of a symbol for a country that is modern, prosperous, democratic, well-governed, low levels of corruption, where things really seem to work pretty well. And we have in the international community this idea that we'd like to turn Somalia and the Congo and Haiti into some version of Denmark. We want it to look like Denmark, but we don't really know how to do this. I spent about 3 years as a visiting professor at the University of Aarhus in Denmark, and so I actually got to know that country fairly well. And one thing that was really evident to me is that the Danes themselves really don't know how they got to be Denmark, because all of this happened so far in the historical past And there's been a kind of amnesia about the painful process of the creation of political institutions that we really had to recover the memory of this. And if we think that institutions are important in the present, then we got to pay a little bit of attention to history. Now I'm going to get back to this issue because the only reason I'm interested in history is as it gives us insight into the present. And I don't want to leave you with the impression that these long-term historical trajectories that I'm going to outline today trap people in their histories, because I think that actually things are more fluid than that. But I think unless we understand some of those historical origins, we're not going to understand the difficulty of creating institutions in contemporary developing countries. And the second volume of the book, the title is Political Order and Political Decay, from the Industrial Revolution to Globalized Democracy. Political institutions don't just evolve and modernize and move in a single forward, progressive direction. They can also go backwards. Institutions everywhere, I think, are subject to decay. And I believe that one of the big challenges for contemporary, rich, prosperous countries like Denmark or the United States or Germany or Japan or anyone else is the prospect of political decay. And so that's also a process that we have to take into account and give some kind of a theory about. So let me begin with a few definitions. Since I'm a professor, I have to define my terms. I want to focus on the creation of political institutions. There are three important sets of institutions that I think define a modern political order. Giving this talk here in Singapore, I may get some pushback on this, but let's see how this works. So the first and most basic institution, I think, is the state. I like to use Max Weber's classic definition of the state as a legitimate monopoly of force or coercion over a defined territory. I think this is a good definition because it distinguishes the state from an NGO, from a labor union, from a multinational corporation. Many other kinds of social organizations exist, but states are unique because they're about power. States are about the ability to concentrate and use power, to use that power to enforce rules over a particular territory. Weber made another important distinction, which was between what he called a patrimonial state and a modern state. And that is also a critical distinction in terms of the development of contemporary institutions in developing countries. A patrimonial institution is an institution built around the friends and family of the ruler or the ruling elite, in which your position in the society is determined by your relationship to the ruler. A modern state, Weber said, by contrast, treats its citizens on an impersonal basis, where it does not matter what your direct relationship to the ruler is. All citizens are owed a certain degree of concern by the state simply by virtue of the fact that they live on the territory that is controlled by the state. And it is that transition from a patrimonial or a traditional state to a modern state that is, I think, one of the most difficult transitions in the book. Now, President de Meyer mentioned that I actually start the book with a discussion of what we know about primate behavior. The reason I do this is that I do not think you can understand human sociability without understanding the sociability of the creatures out of which the human race evolved. And there's been a lot of research on that I think in a certain sense undercuts the early modern philosophical view of human beings as isolated and selfish but rational individuals. I think that the preponderance of evidence coming out of the life sciences and biology and evolutionary biology and comparative anthropology indicates that human beings were social creatures from the start. They did not have to learn how to live in society because it is genetically hardwired into their psyches. But human sociability has certain distinctive characteristics. It's based really on two principles. One is a principle of what the great British biologist William Hamilton called kin selection, which basically says that we are altruistic to other creatures in proportion to the number of genes we share, which means basically a principle of nepotism. We favor genetic relatives. That is one basis. And the other one is what Robert Trivers, another biologist, called reciprocal altruism, that many species, unrelated individuals of either the same species or sometimes even differing species, benefit from the exchange of favors on a direct face-to-face basis. And between these two principles, kin selection and reciprocal altruism, you have the beginnings of human sociability. This is the default form of human social behavior. We like to favor our friends and relatives. The patrimonial state that was the original form of political organization of early societies is built around friends and family. And in a sense, the modern state that I described, the state that treats citizens on an impersonal basis, that says it doesn't matter whether you're a relative of the president or the prime minister or the king or the ruling leader of the country, that kind of a state, in a certain sense, is very unnatural. We do not naturally favor, for example, a qualified individual for a high government post over a relative. We tend to prefer the relative. And so in some sense, to get to this modern political order, to get to a modern state, requires us to violate certain biological proclivities we have for this default form of human sociability. We have to create incentives to make people choose a talented individual over a friend or a relative. And the moment that those modern incentives and those modern institutions break down, we tend to lapse back into a reliance on friends and family. And that's one of the sources, as we'll get to, of political decay. All right, so that's the first set of institutions. So the state is about concentrating and being able to use power in a territorially defined manner. Second important set of institutions, I think, has to do with law and the rule of law. I believe that there are many definitions of the rule of law out there. So rule of law can just mean law and order. A lot of times today it's associated with a particular substantive body of law, developed in the West, having to do with human rights, rights of women, minorities, and so forth. Sometimes it has to do with property rights and contract enforcement, which is the meaning of the rule of law that economists tend to prefer, because that's the basis for economic transactions. I believe that the definition of the rule of law that is the most useful in a political sense is the following. Rule of law are rules reflecting the standards of justice of the broader community, but they have to be binding on the most powerful members of that community if it is to be a true rule of law. So in other words, if the president, the prime minister, the king, the monarch can change the rules as they go along, if they can make up the rules as they go along, that's not the rule of law. The rule of law has to apply to the most powerful. And if you understand the rule of law, so that, there's sometimes what people call rule by law, where the emperor simply makes a command, issues a code, and says everybody has to obey that. That's not rule of law, because that's not binding on the emperor himself. Rule of law has to be binding on the most powerful person if it is truly to be the rule of law. And as you can see, the state and the rule of law are actually on the opposite sides of a balance beam, that the state concentrates and uses power, but the rule of law is a limitation or a constraint on power, properly understood. And so it acts to channel power in ways that are socially approved by the broader community. All right, so that's the second set of institutions. Third set of institutions has to do with accountability. Accountability simply means that the rulers of a society rule for the benefit of the whole community rather than simply in their own self-interest. Now, I use the word accountability very deliberately instead of the word democracy. I think that accountability and democracy, and by democracy I mean procedural democracy, meaning free and fair multi-party elections as we understand them in the West. I think that that overlaps with accountability to a great extent. I mean, the reason we have democratic procedures is to guarantee substantive accountability, but substantive accountability is not necessarily the same thing as procedural accountability. And I think that it is possible for an unelected or non-democratic, non-procedurally democratic political regime to be more or less accountable. So I think here in East Asia, this is an important, it's a particularly important concept. So I think you can argue that if you compare, let's say, the Singaporean government or the Chinese government to, let's say, the government in North Korea, or Zimbabwe, these are more accountable governments, despite the fact that in China, there are no free and fair elections, but they're accountable because there is a sense on the part of the ruling elite that they actually have to be responsive to the needs of the broader community. And conversely, simply the fact that you have democratic procedures in place does not necessarily guarantee that you're going to have substantively accountable outcomes. So we know of many countries in which you have elections, but sometimes they're not free and fair, they're not truly competitive, and sometimes even when they are competitive, the government can still be subject to high levels of corruption, they can be unresponsive, and so forth. And so I think that what is important is to keep your focus on substantive accountability. I believe that there's a high degree of overlap between procedural accountability and substantive accountability, but we have to bear in mind that what we want is the substance and not simply the form that's involved. So again, the state is about power and concentrating and using power. The rule of law is a constraint on power, and accountability is a further set of constraints that aims to make that power directed towards the interest of the whole community rather than simply the interest of the ruling elite. And so a liberal democracy, a modern liberal democracy, is one that I think balances a strong and capable state that can actually deliver services, enforce laws, make policies, and carry them out. It needs that power, but it's power that's constrained according to certain rules and according to the need for responsiveness to the whole community. And in a certain sense, there's a miracle in modern politics that you can have states that are simultaneously unbelievably strong in what they can do and at the same time constrained. And I think that political justice and the proper working of the state, in some sense, both normatively and as a practical matter, rests on the degree of balance that the political order achieves between those goals. You can have states that are rule-bound and democratic, that hold elections, but have extremely weak states and therefore can't do things. They can't procure education, health care, other things for their citizens. And you can have states that are tyrannical because they're very powerful, able to repress their citizens, but they have no accountability and they're not constrained by law. And then you can have states that are somewhere in between, so I would put Singapore in that category. Singapore has a very strong, very competent state. It has a very strong rule of law. On the accountability side, I would say it's got, a high degree of substantive accountability, but on the formal side, I think it would not measure up as a full democracy. So you can have different degrees of these three institutions mixed in different combinations, and I think different political orders are, different balances of these three sets of institutions. So that's the definitional part, so no more definitions. Now we get to the historical part, which is the account of where these institutions come from, and this is the part where I think a lot of this is buried so much in the past that people don't really know a lot of that history. So the question about where the state comes from is really, in my view, a story about China, and I'm actually not talking about the state per se, I'm talking about the modern state. So remember I said the modern state is a state that is impersonal, or it treats its citizens impersonally. So where did that first modern state come from? And I argue in my book that it was invented in China, and it was invented in China a very, very long time ago. And the reason that it was invented was as a result of relentless military competition. There is a well-known sociologist who passed away about 3 or 4 years ago, Charles Tilly, who wrote about state formation in early modern Europe, meaning 17th, 18th century Europe. And he had a thesis that could be summed up in a single phrase: the state makes war and war makes the state. Because in his view, the modern state arose in Europe because of a prolonged period of intense military competition that saw the total number of political units in Europe fall from about 500 at the end of the Middle Ages to about 15 at the time of the First World War. China went through that kind of a process in the Zhou dynasty much, much earlier than Europe, 1800 years before Europe. And the same pressures of military competition created a modern state in China just as it did in Europe. So this is the period from approximately, the Western Zhou dynasty to the Eastern Zhou. So this is from about 1000 BC up until the unification of China. So in this period, China goes from having perhaps 1,800 quasi-tribal units, political units, that gets collapsed down to a much smaller number, about 16 by the beginning of what the Chinese call the Spring and Autumn period. By the time of the Warring States period, this number falls to 7. And at the end of the Warring States period, there's a single victor of this prolonged military, 500-year military conflict, the Western state of Qin, that unifies China for the first time, produces the first national dynasty, the Qin dynasty, in 221 BC. And many of the same imperatives that propelled European state formation operated at this point. So at the beginning of this period, war between Chinese states was fought by aristocrats, highly trained aristocrats riding chariots, but they soon discovered that an infantry army, a massed infantry army, could defeat an army of chariots, but that required conscription. It required the ability to conscript peasants, and then the peasants had to be outfitted. You had to have a big logistics train. Having a logistics train required a civilian bureaucracy that could first tax citizens. So the first cadastral surveys in order to execute a property tax were conducted in Warring States China. That bureaucracy had to collect the taxes, had to create an administrative system that got food and supplies out to these armies in the field. And all of that created this huge incentive for meritocracy. If you hired your cousin as a general, who knew whether he'd be competent or not? And so the idea that you would actually hire public officials who were qualified because they passed an examination or had certain formal credentials started in the crucible of this kind of military competition. This is a lesson that many other countries learned at a much later point. So for example, in America at the time of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was in a midst of a very patrimonial political system in which most appointments to the federal government were made based on political patronage, and many of his early generals were people to whom he owed political debts. And so he lost a number of important battles early in the American Civil War because the Union armies were run by a bunch of incompetent political hacks. And it was only in the course of that very, very bloody competition that the principle of recruiting on the basis of merit took hold, and that's where he got General Grant and finally a group of generals that could actually win the war for him. So this is a process that happened in ancient China 2,500 years ago. The result of this was, in my view, the first modern state. And remember, I said the modern state is an impersonal one. The Chinese state that emerged in the very short-lived Qin dynasty, but then really blossomed in the former Han dynasty, in the 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, were modern in the sense that they ruled a territory through a hierarchical bureaucracy, through relatively impersonal law codes, and they treated citizens, or they aspired to treat citizens, on a relatively impersonal basis. So in a sense, China really invented the modern state. You had states in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Valley of Mexico, and other parts of the world. But all of these, I think, were still patrimonial states. The Chinese, the real achievement for which I don't think they were ever, in Western scholarship really recognized was the creation of a modern state. However, I don't think that this led necessarily to a happy political order, because if you have a state, and not just a state, but a powerful, centralized, bureaucratic modern state, and you have no institutions of constraint, that is to say, no rule of law and no system of democratic accountability, what you end up with is a more perfect tyranny. And in fact, in Chinese history, the ability of the Chinese state to tyrannize over its own citizens was really quite extreme. So, for example, one of the early ministers in the state of Qin, Shang Yang, was very famous, for his support of a, creation of a pretty ruthless dictatorship. And it's no accident that Mao Zedong took Shang Yang as one of his, historical predecessors, because Shang Yang, in a certain sense, created the first totalitarian state that was able to extract resources from Chinese elites, to tax, to move entire populations around, to wipe out whole categories of political opponents if the emperor thought that this was necessary. And so the Chinese political development was very unbalanced in that sense, because the institutions of constraint did not exist. So the question is, where historically do institutions of constraint come from? So let's move on to the second, the rule of law. As I said, the rule of law has to apply to the most powerful if it's going to be the rule of law. Where does that come from? And I think historically it has come out of religion. It has come out of organized transcendental religion. So in ancient Israel, in the Christian West, in Hindu India, and in the Muslim world, in all of these civilizations, you had a body of religious writing that was guarded by a hierarchy of jurists who interpreted religious law, and that religious law did not have its source in the state. It was independent of the state. And the institution, the judicial institutions, the ecclesiastical hierarchy in the Catholic Church, the Brahmin class in India, or the ulama that interpreted Sharia law in the Muslim world, although at times they were unified with political power, in many other periods in history stood independent of the people with the weapons that could coerce people, and therefore acted to some degree as a constraint on political power. In India, you see this very clearly. The Raja, the king, had to go to the Brahmin, the priest, in order to get legitimacy, to get sanctification, and therefore there was a religious break on the power, on the centralizing power of the political rulers. The only world civilization that really never created this kind of a religiously based judicial institution was China. And I believe the reason this never happened in China was China is the only major civilization that really never had a transcendental religion. Because it didn't have a transcendental religion, it didn't have an independent judicial hierarchy to interpret religious law as each one of these other world civilizations did. And so, in a certain sense, the rule of law is fairly foreign. So the Chinese emperors created, that there was a Tang code and a Han code and so forth, but these were all essentially commands of the emperor. They weren't constraints on the emperor himself. The civilization in which law became the most deeply rooted was that of Western Europe. And it became rooted because of the power of the Catholic Church, basically. And again, this is a history that a lot of Westerners don't understand. In the 10th century, in the 11th century, in Europe, the priests and bishops of the Catholic Church were appointed by the Holy Roman Emperor and the territorial princes of Europe. That is to say, priests and bishops in the Catholic Church were not appointed by the church itself. So the church was what was called a Caesaro-Papist organization. It was unified with political power. In the course of the 11th century, there was a massive confrontation between these territorial princes and a very powerful papal party led by one of the great early popes, Pope Gregory VII, who argued that the church itself is not going to have any moral authority unless we disentangle it from territorial rule. First of all, the church has to clean up its own act. So priests and bishops, they could marry, they could have children, they would scheme to get their children benefices, to insert themselves into court politics. Gregory said, no, you have to have celibacy of the priesthood. The only way to solve the problem of nepotism in the Catholic Church is to forbid priests to have children. And basically, you know, the church is their family. And so a lot of, I think, contemporary Catholics don't understand that the celibacy of the priesthood, it's not a biblical injunction. There's no place in the Bible that tells you that priests and bishops should not marry. It was actually a practical measure to get beyond the nepotistic principle within the church itself. Gregory's papal party then went on to essentially launch a war against the Holy Roman Emperor for the right to appoint its own cadres. It could not be an autonomous organization as long as the emperor could appoint popes and bishops. This led to a big conflict called the investiture crisis. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV was excommunicated. He had to go to Canossa to plead for forgiveness from the Pope, barefoot in the snow. This war went on for the next 2 generations, and at the end of it, in the Concordat of Worms, the Catholic Church finally won its right to appoint its own cadres. So for the first point, it really became institutionally autonomous of territorial power, and that is really the basis of modern ecclesiastical law. The church at the same point, at that time, revived this Roman law in an attic in a library in northern Italy, the Justinian Code, which then became the basis for the continental civil law tradition. And so law in Europe is extremely deeply rooted. It's based on very, very ancient institutions. And I think what a lot of Europeans themselves don't realize is that law preceded state building in Europe. So when in the 16th, 17th centuries you got these ambitious monarchs that wanted to behave like Chinese emperors and create powerful centralized bureaucratic regimes, they had to do this against a background of a pre-existing rule of law that limited their ability to do that. All right? Democracy, or institutions of accountability, where do they come from? They come from a kind of historical accident. So in the late Middle Ages, every European country had a peculiar feudal institution known as the estates. In Spain, they were known as the Cortes. In Russia, Zemsky Sobor. In France, they were known as the sovereign courts or the Parlement. And in England, it was known as the Parliament. So this was basically an assemblage of the nobility, sometimes the gentry, sometimes the upper bourgeoisie that were represented. These were basically the elites of the country that had the resources and the money, and the king had to go to these estates to get taxes. And so in the beginning in the late 16th century, these ambitious monarchs decided, why do I have to go to these estates? I want to be able to tax everybody directly. And so there's a long, prolonged struggle between monarch and estate in every European country. The estates lost in France, in Spain, in Russia, in most other parts of continental Europe, except for Poland and Hungary. They were fought to a standstill in one country, and that country was England, where the parliamentary side was well-armed, well-organized, motivated by Protestant religion. They fought a civil war with the king. They cut off the head of one king, Charles I. They had a brief republic and then a restoration. And then in 1688, another king was deposed by the same parliamentary forces. A new king was brought in from the Netherlands with his wife Mary. So King William and Mary started a new dynasty under a constitutional settlement known as the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution established the principle of no taxation without representation. So from that point forward, no English monarch was able to tax the English people without getting the consent of Parliament. At the moment of the emergence of William and Mary as the king and queen of England, the philosopher John Locke, who had been living in the Dutch city of Leiden, who wrote the Second Treatise of Government, came over with Queen Mary to England. In the Second Treatise, he said that the basis of legitimacy, the basis of obedience to any form of authority is consent of the governed. And so the two principles coming out of the Glorious Revolution were, first, no taxation without representation, and second, legitimacy and authority coming from consent of the governed. The American Revolution happened less than 100 years later, in 1776, with the Declaration of Independence. That declaration was based on these twin principles, and the American Revolution was launched under those headings: no taxation without representation, and legitimacy coming from the consent of the governed. And this became the principle of modern democracy in North America and in Europe. And regimes that were based both on law and on this kind of democratic accountability became extremely powerful. Particularly, the ability to protect property rights meant that such regimes were the perfect takeoff points for capitalist development in the 19th and 20th centuries, and for that reason, there's a very strong correlation between this kind of balanced liberal democracy with state, rule of law, and accountability and high levels of economic development. All right? So that's the historical part. So let me fast forward a little bit to the present, because I think that in many respects there are many continuities between these historical stories, these very long-term historical stories, and contemporary outcomes. As I said, China had a very different path of development than Europe did. So in Europe, the first of the three institutions to emerge was actually the rule of law. The state came later. The state came several centuries later, and democracy came even later than that. In China, the state came first, and because the state came first, it was able to forestall the emergence of social actors, which in Europe became the source of opposition and resistance to the state. So in Europe, you had an entrenched blood nobility, you had commercial cities, you had a Catholic church, and then independent religious orders, all of which could resist the power of the state. In China, the state from the time of the Qing unification was so powerful that it could actually head off the emergence of these independent social actors. And that is, in a certain sense, the legacy of the contemporary Chinese state under the Communist Party. China, its long-standing political tradition is a modern, powerful, bureaucratic, modern state without the instruments of constraint that exist in other societies. That's what the Chinese were good at 2,300 years ago, and it's still what they're good at. They're very good at running a centralized state, but it continues to be an unbalanced one. If you compare contemporary China and India, in a certain sense, India is at the opposite extreme. So a lot of people say, well, of course, China is a authoritarian country led by a communist country, and India is a democracy, or has been since the formation of the Indian Republic. And most people say, well, where does that come from? It comes from something fairly recent, communism or the British Raj in India. I would argue that the origin of these political systems is much, much older than that. So the Chinese have been doing centralized bureaucracy, merit-based bureaucracy for a very long period of time. India has not been a democracy for a very long period of time, but if you look at Indian history, there was never a period of this intense, centralized, bureaucratic dictatorship ever really in Indian history. So in China, beginning with the Qing unification, you had these interdynastic periods in which the central government broke down and then power devolved into warlords and so forth. But the default position of China has always been to reunify into a powerful centralized state. India's history over that same 2,000-year period is almost the mirror opposite. There are certain periods at the time of the Maurya dynasty was contemporaneous with the Qin dynasty in China, about the 3rd century BC, and then at the time of the Gupta dynasty in about the 3rd century AD. These were brief periods in which maybe 2/3 of the Indian subcontinent was united under a single ruling house, but they lasted for maybe 2 or 3 generations and then fell apart. And the default situation of India has been to be a much smaller, decentralized, almost village-level society in which political authority is exerted not through a centralized bureaucracy, but at a much lower level. And when the Mughals invaded and when the British invaded, these foreigners had more organized forms of centralized rule, but neither of them were able to actually penetrate Indian society. And I would argue that the contemporary Indian government has really not been able to penetrate Indian society in the way that Chinese governments have penetrated Chinese society, for 2,000 years. And you can see that, today in contemporary outcomes. So what's China really, really good at? It's good at infrastructure. It's really good at these massive engineering projects that require strong centralized power and that require kind of weak pushback from the rest of society. So when China wants to create the Three Gorges Dam, it requires moving something like 1.3 million people out of the floodplain. There is resistance to this, but the Chinese government just does that because Chinese people aren't organized into a civil society that can resist that kind of exercise of state power. By contrast, India is nothing but this kind of organization. It's got a relatively weak centralized state, and it's got a very powerfully organized civil society that can push back. And one of the reasons that I think India has had trouble doing these kinds of infrastructure projects is, precisely because the pushback is too strong and the social resistance to this kind of exercise of power is too great. In my personal opinion, China, is too good at exercising this kind of, strong centralized power, and India needs more of it. The proper, as I said, in my view, normatively, I think the right outcome is balance. And so neither of these countries, in my view, has it right. By the way, I'm an American, and I'm not arguing that America's got it right either. The American political system, the American constitutional system, as designed by James Madison and other American founding fathers, is based on a decentralized system of checks and balances because the American experience was resistance to the tyranny of the English monarchy. And so American political culture is all about resistance to any kind of exercise of centralized political authority. And that's why the American Constitution splits power between branches, between a president and two powerful houses of Congress. There's a separate judiciary. Power is further devolved on a state and local level. And I think that when you combine that with the degree of polarization that exists in the American society more broadly, today what you get is gridlock. What you get is this paralysis, and U.S. Congress has not passed a budget for the last 3 years because they can't agree on whether you should raise taxes or cut spending. And so I don't think the Americans have got this balance right in the end. Now, I just want to conclude with a couple of observations. So I think that, first of all, political decay is omnipresent. So most of what I've talked about is political development. Decay happens for two reasons. Institutions become rigid. Institutions are created to meet certain social needs under certain conditions, but when those conditions change, people don't change the institutions. They become wedded to the institutions for intrinsic reasons, and therefore they don't see any reason why they should interrupt tradition and so forth. The second reason has to do with elites. Elites in any society will use their influence to get political power to protect their positions politically, and they capture the state. The reason that the Han Dynasty broke down in the 3rd century was because a number of very powerful families in Chinese society had basically captured the state, and the state fell apart, and actually those families continued to be extremely powerful through the Sui and Tang dynasties, and you didn't get back to a kind of impersonal bureaucratic system really until the Northern Song period, which was several hundred years later. So this pressure of elites to recapture the state is something that is universal and very powerful because, as I said, that's kind of the default form of human sociability. all countries have to worry about that. And so when I think about the future of the United States versus the future of, let's say, the China model, part of what I think about is which of these countries is going to be subject to political decay and which country can actually correct this political decay more easily. China is a little bit younger in terms of its current institutions, and so I think the rigidity hasn't quite set in. But if you think about the agenda facing Xi Jinping right now, he may want to liberalize certain aspects of the economy, but he faces now actually very, very deep entrenched interests. The state-owned enterprises, different parts of the Communist Party that have their own empires to protect. They've been trying to dismantle the railway ministry for several decades now, unsuccessfully, because these are really very powerful organizations. And similarly, I think in the United States, we've got a big problem with interest groups and lobbyists who are able to, manipulate Congress for their own purposes and make policy making, I think, extremely difficult because it's hard to generate, a sense of common purpose and public interest that somehow stands above those interests. The final point I'll make is just the following about change. So here I've just given you the story. India and China, in a sense, have been characterized by these continuities over a 2,000-year period, and this leaves a lot of people thinking that things are always going to be that way. So China will always be a centralized bureaucratic dictatorship, and India will always be a decentralized, society, ground level, very powerful society-driven, but relatively weak state society. And I think that this could be true for long periods of history because economic growth didn't happen really until 200 years ago. Most of these societies were pretty stable agrarian societies, century after century after century. All of this ends with the process of industrialization. With industrialization, all of a sudden you get this big dynamic force that restacks the social deck, that creates new social classes, and that basically changes the conditions for government. And so one of the biggest challenges I think that an authoritarian country like China faces is the rise of a middle class. Right now there's maybe 300-400 million people that would count as middle class in China. They have very different expectations. I think actually most of the Chinese middle class actually likes the current Chinese government because they've done extremely well, but their expectations are much higher than peasants or poor people, right? And if the expectations are disappointed, that class historically in other societies has been politically a very dangerous and volatile one. And so we saw just in this past year, Turkey and Brazil, and 3 years ago we saw in the Arab Spring countries that had been stable, and at least in the case of Turkey and Brazil, they're actually democracies that had done extremely well economically, all of a sudden explode in protests. And who do you think was protesting in these countries? It was not the poor, it was not the dispossessed, it was precisely educated middle-class people. And I think one of the big questions that China will have to face is, does its political system open up to accommodate the demands of these rising new classes, or does it try to keep the same, highly centralized bureaucratic system, albeit one that's, relatively responsive, but does it try to keep that system in place? And my personal view is that unless the system adapts to be more formally accountable to those people, it down the road, its economic model at some point is going to run out of steam, and it's going to face some challenges. In my second volume, I spent a lot of time talking about the United States and its problems. I'm not going to bore you with that tonight. If any of you want to ask me about that in the question and answers, you're welcome to. But at that point, I think I'm going to stop talking and invite all of your questions and comments. So thank you very much.